Welcome, everyone. Just a quick word to introduce myself. I mean, you see my name, of course, just on your screen. I'm Katharina Niemeyer. I'm a professor of media theory at the University of Quebec in Montreal and director of the Research Center, Culture, Arts and Society of the University of Quebec in Montreal. And before introducing the exhibition and symposium topic today, as well as our invited panelists, we would like to begin actually by acknowledging that the University of Quebec in Montreal is located on unceded indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which our exhibition takes place. Tiohtià:ke Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So in the name of the Écran Total Screen organizers and also as a co-curator of the upcoming exhibition tomorrow, I have the pleasure to introduce this pre-event of the upcoming official exhibition, which is starting tomorrow, as I said. So exhibited for the first time in Canada at the Montreal Centre de Design, University of Quebec in Montreal, the exhibition Écran Total Screen features Jean Baudrillard's photographs in conversation with pieces by Adam Bezanter, Charlie Dayan, Clint Enns, Mishke Henner, Wasim Bhatti, Penelope Umbrico, and Chouanier. In conjunction with the exhibition, a series of international conferences, roundtables, and workshops will take place this week until May 25th in order to critically explore the different roles and forms of screens in our daily social and cultural practices. I will share later all the other events coming up for those who might just be connected today and would like to join the other events that will take place in the next days. So it is in the context of this symposium program that I'm very happy to introduce you our 5 invited guests that you can see here on the screen, who are spotlighted. If you don't see them spotlighted, you have to go on your Zoom interface up on your right-hand side on the upper field. You go on showing, I don't know, it's affichage en français. And then you go on a speaker or intervenant, and then you will see everyone spotlighted in case that it doesn't work. As you see, we also have a subtitle thing which Zoom is offering us. It is quite funny when we speak French and it is subtitled, but it works a bit in English, but it's especially for the post-production later, as we got the good news that part of the Total Screen events will be featured at the International Biennale in Venice of Architecture from this summer on. So it is, and I come back to my little text, it is in the context of the symposium program that I'm very happy to introduce you to our 5 invited guests, 5 scholars and artists from the Berkeley University of California, who will talk about their research creation realized within the Media Metadata Research Lab. So first one is Abigail de Kosnik, is an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley, in the Berkeley Center for New Media at the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. She is the author of Rock Archives, Digital Cultural Memory and Media Fandom, Massachusetts Institute Press, 2016. Benjamin de Kosnik is an artist and engineer who works on web standards and performance at Mozilla. He has exhibited at Hong Kong Open Print Shop in Hong Kong, Gallery West Ginza, Tokyo, Japan, Root Division in San Francisco, Pro Arts in Oakland, and the San Luis Obispo Art Museum in California. Veronika Jackson, I can't really show you like that, you know, so you spot yourself, Veronika is there, is an exhibition interpretive and graphic communication designer. She has worked on several cultural significant and historical prominent projects, including the inaugural and permanent exhibit at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture, the reinstallation of the Hall of African Culture, African Voices, at the Smithsonian National Museum Matthew Studies, California, Berkeley. He holds master degree in gender studies from Utrecht University and the University of Oviedo. Jaclyn Zhou is a PhD student in performance studies with a designated emphasis in new media, also at Berkeley, and she earned her bachelor degree in journalism from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Media, Integrated Marketing, Communications. So during the following 45-50 minutes around, the 5 of you will present and discuss diversity on streaming platforms in pandemic times. And we will then have an exchange with the participants. You can either write your questions in the chat during the presentation or afterwards, or then just get your hand up or just say in the comment box that you would like to ask questions or discuss. We can see this later. I ask everyone friendly to not interrupt our presentation with some Zoom bombing or any other funny things. So the floor is open for you. We are very happy in the name of all the Total Screen organizers to have you with us today at this pre-Vernissage event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katharina, and to all of the Écran Total Total Screen organizers. We're very happy to be here today. Greetings from San Francisco, which is the Aboriginal homeland of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We are, as Katharina said, the Media Metadata Research Lab, mmrl, which we pronounce as merl. merl works at the intersection of humanities, art, data, and design to study media. The project we will share with you today investigates diversity on television shows that debuted on streaming platforms, specifically Netflix, Disney Plus, and HBO Max, so all US-based platforms, from January 2020 through March 2021, in other words, during the time of the global pandemic. We know that the US media industries have become more interested in diversity and have expressed a greater commitment to diverse representation over the past 7 years. In 2014, Laverne Cox, a trans actress who was a main cast member on the Netflix hit series Orange is the New Black, appeared on the cover of Time magazine as the exemplar of what Time called the transgender tipping point. This issue announced that the high profile of trans celebrities such as Cox, Caitlyn Jenner, and Janet Mock had quote unquote tipped the scales of social judgment from intolerance to tolerance, acceptance, and recognition of trans people. Of course, as Cox and many other trans activists, artists, and scholars pointed out, in the wake of this Time magazine issue, the trans tipping point may have meant that trans people became more visible in US society, but this visibility also led to a spike in harassment and violence against trans people. So the tipping point has not been altogether positive. In April 2016, April Rain, pictured here, launched a social media campaign, #OscarsSoWhite, criticizing the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences for its poor record of nominating creatives of color. That year was the second year in a row that none of the 20 actors nominated for Oscars and only one of the 5 directors nominated were people of color. In 2017, Tarana Burke's campaign, and this is Burke in the center of the photograph, Tarana Burke's campaign, Me Too, which she had initiated in 2006, went viral as women in Hollywood began to use it to share their stories of being sexually harassed and or assaulted in the industry, with many allegations leveled at renowned producer and studio mogul Harvey Weinstein. The Me Too hashtag was subsequently taken up in many professions outside the media industries, but it is strongly linked to Hollywood's oppression of women. So we consider the trans tipping point, OscarsSoWhite, and Me Too as 3 different but related moments when the US media industries were pushed from within and without to diversify its storytelling, to represent a range of genders and races and ethnicities more and in more robust ways. And Hollywood responded to this cultural moment, this collective pressure to showcase more female and BIPOC leads. Warner Brothers heavily marketed its first big budget film centering on a female superhero, Wonder Woman, in 2017, and Marvel similarly hyped up its first film centering on a Black superhero with a nearly all Black cast, Black Panther, in 2018, and both films became blockbuster hits. The Academy of Motion Pictures set a goal of diversifying its membership, hoping that doing so would help to diversify Oscars nominations. And in 2020, the Academy announced that it admitted more women, people of underrepresented ethnicities, and people from outside the US in its entering class than it ever had before. However, let's note that even with recent classes being more diverse, the Academy still consists of only 19% members of color and only 33% women members. As another response to the pressure to diversify, the Academy Awards issued diversity guidelines for its Best Picture nominees in 2020, stating that to be eligible for Best Picture, a film has to have employed a certain number of workers from underrepresented ethnicities in its cast, creative leadership, crew, and marketing team. And at the same time that the Oscars gained some approbation for taking steps towards promoting diversity in films, another major film award, the Golden Globes, received heavy criticism because its organization, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, or HFPA, came under scrutiny for many unethical practices, including having 0 Black members among its voting body and ignoring Black-led media texts such as Bridgerton and Girls Trip. NBC has canceled next year's Golden Globes ceremony, and we have yet to see if the Golden Globes will return, and if it does, how it will better attend to diversity. And much of this conversation and movement towards greater diversity in US media took place within the wider social context of the Trump era in US politics, in which we saw an upsurge in attacks on human rights in many ways, on immigrants' rights, trans people's rights, women's rights. We saw a rise in racist and other oppressive policies, acts, and discourses. So we should keep in mind that the Me Too movement on social media began about 10 months after the Worldwide Women's March, which took place one day after Trump's inauguration in 2017. And we should know that the Academy's new diversity requirements for Best Picture were announced in September 2020 on the heels of a summer of Black Lives Matter protests in response to the police killing of George Floyd. So Hollywood's moves towards more diverse representation and better representation of diverse characters must be seen as responses to larger social and cultural drives. And the television industry has been as much an object of discussion and scrutiny as the film industry in the society-wide push towards diversity. Over the past year, we've seen the release of 4 different reports quantifying diversity in US television series. This is a report on diversity in TV from UCLA's Social Sciences Division, and they have been releasing annual reports on diversity in Hollywood for several years running now, but the rest of these are new. This is a report on diverse representation and inclusion on TV from Nielsen, the ratings company. This is a report on inclusion in Netflix originals from USC Annenberg, and Netflix sponsored this research. And this is a report from the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, or GLAAD, on LGBTQ+ representation in television. So our idea at merl was to create our own system to score diversity in media texts and to evaluate television in a period of time when the entire US media landscape has been fairly focused on diversity and inclusion, and also at a time when streaming TV platforms became a primary source of fictional screen-based content for many millions of Americans, as we were at home more than ever and cinemas were largely closed. The goals we set for ourselves for our diversity scoring system is that we would produce quantitative and graphic assessments understandable at a glance. But when we say understandable at a glance, is it? That's a huge question mark for us. After all, we're about to give a whole presentation explaining in words how the system works. So I don't know how understandable it is at a glance. You might have to tell us. Our system accounts for television characters' ethnicities, genders, sexualities, nationalities, ages, and species. It allows for text-to-text and platform-to-platform comparisons. It builds on earlier types of assessments like the Bechdel test, the Duvernay test, and the Kent test, which equip media audiences to ask, how well does this text represent gender? How well does it represent people of color or women of color? How well does this text do on this axis of social difference? And we hope it will spark new types of conversations around diversity in media, including conversations today during the Q&A. I hope that gave you a sense of the context and imperatives of our project. Now I'm going to turn it over to another member of the merl team, Jaclyn.
Thank you, Gail. So to explain our system in a little bit more detail, It uses data from a GitHub repository maintained by our research team. So in the repository, we collect information about a large set of mass media texts. The fields in the tagging schema can be roughly divided into two groups. Here on the left, you see fields about the text as a whole, and then on the right, fields about characters and their identities. In regards to the text as a whole, we tag for information about production and distribution, genre, and plot. Those are not involved in calculating the diversity score of the text, but they offer information that allows us to read the text's diversity and representation in the context of its time, place, and generic conventions. Next slide, please. So in regards to character tagging, we identify the 6 lead characters of a media text, and we tag each character's ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality, age, and a category we refer to as Z, which denotes species in practice. Each category includes super tags and secondary tags. Each character is required to have at least 1 super tag per category. Next slide, please. As for secondary tags, they are not required and they don't count towards the text diversity score, but they can offer context for and modifications on the super tags. For example, adding a queer subtext secondary tag to a character who is super tagged as straight. Secondary tags are also where we account for discrepancies between character and actor, which is denoted by the blank playing blank secondary tag. So the goal of the character tagging schema is to establish a set of discrete buckets that characters can be sorted into so that they can be counted and added up into a text's diversity score. In other words, the goal here is to quantify diversity, to give a numerical score to how many diverse identities are present within a text. Next slide, please. So a text's diversity score is based on the number of unique super tags among the 6 lead characters. The highest score a text can receive per category is 6, which would be if every character had a different super tag in that category. Thus, with 6 categories, the highest diversity score a text as a whole could receive is 36. At a glance, this number gives us insight into the sheer quantity of diversity in a text's main cast. In other words, the higher the diversity score, the more identities are represented in the main cast, thus the more diverse the main cast is. Next slide, please. So for example, here we have the ethnicity tags for the HBO show Euphoria. For the lead character, who is biracial, we have the super tags white, black, and multi. For the other characters, we have characters who are tagged black, and we have characters who are tagged white. Euphoria has 3 distinct super tags, multi, black, and white. Therefore, it receives an ethnicity score of 3. So when we first began tagging for this project a year ago, the tagging schema looked quite different from today's schema. But in the course of tagging, we realized that the tags we had did not accurately represent the characters we were seeing in these media texts. As we continue to encounter increasingly complex characters and situations, as well as limit cases that tested the very premise of identity tagging, the schema likewise evolved to become more complex. This speaks to the fundamentally Sisyphean task of sorting the infinite variety of human and non-human identities into discrete buckets. There is always something that reveals the gaps in your categorization system. Thus, the current schema, that is the current lists of super tags and secondary tags, and the limits of their applicability is still a work in progress. It continues to evolve to suit the needs of the texts we tag and our research goals. And there are many unresolved questions that we are still working through. For example, as the number of super tags has proliferated in this past year, there is now a desperate need for simplification and streamlining. Another issue, one that speaks to the weakness of quantification in general, is that numbers alone consistently fail to tell the whole story. The goal of the quantitative diversity score was to have an at-a-glance, apples-to-apples means of comparing texts, but this has proved impossible. For example, all the identity categories are measured on the same 0 to 6 scale, but the numbers mean very different things about representation based on the category. For example, a 4 in age, which is consistently one of the highest scores, is quite different from a 4 in sexuality, which is consistently one of the lowest. But from the perspective of a numerical diversity score, a 4 is just a 4. Next slide, please. The fact of the matter is that there is no purely quantitative mode of determining diversity. No matter how complex a schema is, a numerical diversity score by itself doesn't accurately capture how a media text represents its diverse characters. This is a question of the quantity of representation versus the quality of that representation, with the diversity score itself being unable to capture the latter. For example, one could imagine a text that has a significant quantity of minority characters, but represents those characters quite poorly, refracting them through stereotypes, dated tropes, violence, and tokenism. Conversely, there are also those texts that receive a low diversity score precisely because they center on minority communities and the violence that those communities face. A number alone does not account for the difference in representation between, for example, Beyonce's Black is King, which receives a 1 in ethnicity because it is wholly Black-led, and a show like Friends, for example, which has no significant characters of color. This concern with the diversity score's inability to account for the crucial non-numerical differences between texts is what led us to develop the bias tag system to supplement the numerical diversity score. Next slide, please. So here is an example of a diversity and bias score for a single text, Tiger King. The number 14 is the diversity score. The purely accidental string of letters, BS, are bias tags, which are our qualitative diversity markers. We apply bias tags to indicate when a media property fails to pass a set of conditions or rules about its content. Some of them involve simply counting, like, are there ethnicity values other than white? While others involve more nuanced readings of how, for example, characters of color are developed and treated in the text. Next slide, please. So currently we have 10 bias tags: B for failing the Bechdel test, D for failing the Duvernay test, E for involving potentially offensive forms of ethnic impersonation, F for fetishizing or sexualizing BIPOC women and girls, Q for involving potentially offensive forms of gender and sexual identity impersonation, S for stereotyping of minority or female characters, T for tokenized minority characters, V for when minority characters appear only as the victims or perpetrators of violence, W for shows that have white-only casts, and Y, in which no female cast leads are aged 50 or above. Note that, as the term bias tag suggests, we apply bias tags only for problematic elements. This is because our schema takes good representation as the baseline and bias as the deviation. In other words, we believe that good representation should be the norm and therefore unremarkable. Next slide, please. So back to Tiger King. It has a diversity and bias score of 14 BS. 14 is a relatively unexceptional diversity score. It's neither particularly high nor particularly low. In fact, Tiger King has an above average gender and sexuality score for both its platform, which is Netflix, and among all the texts that we sampled. So really, this should suggest that Tiger King does an above average job with gender and sexual diversity. But the B, which is failing the Bechdel test, and the S, which is stereotyping of minority or female characters, reveal that Tiger King has a significant issue with the representation of female characters. This is consistent with the criticism it received for the misogynistic portrayal of Carol Baskin, the show's antagonist, so to speak, and major female cast member. Thus, we can see that, in contrast to the numerical diversity score alone, bias tags are able to help capture a more complete picture of a text representation. So now my colleague Matthew is going to discuss some of our initial findings.
Thanks, Jaclyn. Gail, if you could swing us to the next slide. Great. So today we are going to look at our findings in the form of what we call the 3x10. And what the 3x10 shows are the 3 platforms we're looking at: Netflix, Disney+, and HBO Max, and 10 of the most hyped and discussed media properties released during the pandemic on those platforms. So what you're looking at is each of the 10 properties divided by platform and their diversity scores for each identity category, plus the total diversity score and their bias tags. Next. So when we look at the 3 by 10, we see that Netflix as a platform has a diversity score of 129, Disney Plus is at 145, and HBO Max is at 140. So in the grand scheme of things, that's not a lot of variance. And again, because our numerical score is about the quantity and not the quality of representation, just because Disney Plus has the highest score doesn't necessarily mean that it's doing the best job of equitable representation. Next. On the other hand, not only does Netflix have the lowest diversity score, but it also has the most bias tags and the greatest diversity of bias tags. So that's potentially pointing to more consistent challenges when it comes to representation over at Netflix. The 3 most common bias tags across platforms are Y, which means the text has no female characters over age 50, B, which means it fails the Bechdel test, and Q, which in these cases means there's a straight actor playing a gay character. So the 3 by 10 allows us to aggregate these bias tags and to ask questions about platforms as a whole, such as why does HBO, which of the 3 platforms is arguably the one geared most towards adults, struggle the most with age diversity in its female characters? Or why does Disney Plus not have any Qs? Is it because they're doing a great job of hiring queer actors to play queer characters, or are there just no queer characters there to begin with? Next, please. So when we look at the scores for each identity category, some general trends start to emerge. Firstly, all platforms have more diversity in ethnicity than gender, sexuality, or nationality. When it comes to gender, the average of gender identities ranges from 2.1 to 2.5 across the platforms. And at first glance, because the average is greater than 2, that might suggest that these platforms have moved beyond binary gender, but that may not actually be the case, as we'll see in a second. Some texts include 2 or more sexual identities, and Netflix is doing the best on this front with an average of 2. Nationality averages are less. So for the most part, these texts are either US-centric or they're set in outer space or another universe, but there are some exceptions to that, like Bridgerton or The Crown or Mulan. Next. Species and age are somewhat troublesome categories for our scoring purposes. Species adds a lot of padding to certain texts, particularly sci-fi or fantasy texts, in which there may be, for example, a human character plus a metahuman and an alien and an AI, for example. So when there are multiple species, there are multiple super tags for ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, because for most species other than human, these categories are often ambiguous or unknown. Or for example, in a show like Raised by Wolves, gender gets tagged as cis male and cis female for the human characters, and then male and female for the AI characters. So the gender score for Raised by Wolves is 4, even though the gender binary is still operative in that universe. So something we're still pondering is how we account for this score inflation. And at the same time, it's very important to tag different species because oftentimes species difference is doing the work of other social difference. So for example, representations of aliens may be working through issues around Blackness or queerness, and scholars like Andre Carrington have written about this in regards to texts like Star Trek. And on the same note, age can similarly pad a diversity score. So there may be an intergenerational show that's all white and all straight, but it still may have a higher diversity tag because of age. So ultimately, high diversity scores are not always indicative of a text approach to ethnicity, sexuality, and gender, because they are offset by these identity categories that are often viewed as less controversial, but they're still weighted equally, as Jaclyn drew our attention to. So we always knew that we would not let the diversity scores stand alone in a context like the 3x3. We were always going to offer a thicker description of how these social identity categories work in media through our written analyses and through our glyphs, which we'll show you in a second. But seeing the scores plotted on the 3x3 really underscored for us the insufficiency of a solely quantitative method of scoring. And in fact, some of our findings have made us question really the efficacy of our diversity scoring system when we look at how certain text scores compare to each other. Next. So in our schema, WandaVision on Disney Plus has the highest diversity score and no bias tags, but Defy Bloods, which is a Black-led text, and Hamilton, which features a cast of people of color, both have low diversity scores. Defy Bloods has the lowest on the 3x10, and they have several bias tags. And these are interesting cases because they are generally thought of as texts that do important representational work. So whether or not that's true, they're not doing so great when it comes to our numerical scoring. On the one hand, Defy Bloods attends to the specific experiences of Black veterans and attempts to stray from the standard white Vietnam War narrative. But on the other hand, it still gives us a US-centric, stereotypical, and Orientalist representation of Vietnamese people. And then there's Hamilton, which in theory is a retelling of American history that foregrounds the contributions of people of color, but it's filtering these stories of white founding fathers through a diverse cast. So fundamentally, it's not about BIPOC stories. Even so, our diversity score on its own may be too reductive to capture the representational work both texts are doing, both diegetically and in terms of industry practices, particularly when their scores are put side by side with other texts like WandaVision. Next. So obviously there are some issues, as Jaclyn referenced too, that are yet to be resolved within diversity scoring and bias tagging, especially around some of the scores that we now have that potentially uplift properties that have a high numerical score, but really just reflect shallow or depoliticized ideas about multiculturalism or mere inclusion over media properties that are emphatically centering Black characters and Black experiences. So text on the screen like Defy Bloods, Insecure, and I May Destroy You focus on specific communities that are historically underrepresented in Hollywood. So despite having relatively low or average diversity scores and having more bias tags, we don't want our scoring system to turn out to be a condemnation of them, even as at the same time, we're obviously critical of the biases that are present. So a few other things to note about our scores: the presence or absence of bias tags is not always a clear indication of what a text is doing regarding representation, and even at times can be misleading. Next. So for example, the Bechdel test or the Bechdel-Wallace test is often used or treated in popular culture as a surefire shortcut for determining how feminist a text is. But in reality, Alison Bechdel herself has emphasized that this test is merely a way to get the conversation about women's representation started. So just because a text passes the Bechdel test doesn't mean that it's good to go on its representation of women or that it's feminist. And also the absence of bias tags cannot be taken as proof that a text is flawlessly representing women or people of color or queer people. It simply means that that text lacks the problematics that we are tagging for. Next. So in terms of next steps for the schema, we are currently beginning to experiment with what we're calling reception tags. So diversity scores and bias tags are about what is taking place on screen and in the text production, but they don't necessarily account for either the positive or negative feelings that audiences have towards text. So this could be, for example, disidentification, where certain communities attach themselves to texts that seem to have harmful representation of those communities, or conversely, groups reacting negatively to texts that on the surface seem to offer positive representation, especially to people outside of that group. So again, early stages, we're trying to find a way to implement them and standardize them. So next. One example of this where the interpretive value add of reception tags really becomes clear is Never Have I Ever from Netflix, Mindy Kaling's show. It has one bias tag, Y for young, and the diversity score is 13, which is pretty average, taking all the text we've sampled together. However, the reception tags give us a pretty good idea of what is happening representationally. It gets a positive tag for relatable DESI content, and also negative reception tags for backlash against dated Indian and Indian American stereotypes and casteism. So these tags are keying us into how the text representation of ethnicity triggers different responses from the same group of people depending on their interpretation. So again, this is reaffirming that no quantitative categorization schema is capacious enough to capture all of these nuances. But this scoring does not stand alone. There is a visual component. So now I'm going to turn it over to our fabulous artist, Veronika.
Thank you, Matthew. So Benjamin, are you going to pull up our graphics? Because as Abigail said, it's difficult to, understand all of this at a glance. And as an exhibit designer and a visual artist, that is like my mode of being, is trying to create visuals that people can understand at a glance. So with that said, to back up a bit, it all started with Du Bois and W.E.B. Du Bois and his data portraits. This is the cover of a book that gave us a lot of inspiration for our graphics. And you can continue to scroll, Benjamin. And it's this whole piece of like how Du Bois took the sociology of Negro life in Georgia in the late 1800s and how he graphically, visually portrayed that with these data sets and with these graphics. And so that really was the inspiration for a lot of the glyphs, the visualization of the glyphs that we designed as a result of this project. So for example, this one is showing the city and rural population in Georgia. But what was interesting about this graphic just simply is like the colors that were used, but also the lines that were used and how he's using straight lines and diagonal lines. And then it comes into this kind of spiral element that you'll see later in the graphics that we are incorporating. And so we can continue to scroll down with this and look at also just the grid, the bar charts also. We know that that is a typical kind of like visualization of data, but the way that Du Bois is using it, he's also adding color to represent values. And so we took that as a cue also in our graphics. What I wanted to point out with this is just like how he also allowed some certain lines to overlap and sometimes not. And so verticals overlap horizontals, horizontals overlap verticals. So he's setting up a hierarchy that we also looked at with our graphics. So these series of plates are very interesting, and it's great that these have been preserved in a way and that we can go back and look at these. And it shows the timelessness of Du Bois and his thinking and his visuals. So let's continue to scroll down so we can get to what we were looking at with all this data, right? And how you visualize this data. So we looked at three overarching elements, and our graphics are going to talk about three overarching elements in the data visualization. It's ethnicity, gender, and age. And how do you portray ethnicity? So coming up with this color scheme for what and how you represent an ethnic group. We didn't want to go to the standard of like black and white. And in fact, in our color scheme, black and white is used only for editorial purposes. For the purposes of representing ethnicities in this series of visualizations, we chose primary colors as a tool. And also I kind of flipped the script on who gets represented with the colors. So in this instance, black is red. So black people are represented as red, red for blood. White people are represented as brown or dark brown. So that's a really different way of looking, okay, how do white people want to feel as brown at this point, right? So it's looking at a different way of viewing that kind of culture. Asian is a primary color and it's blue and not the typical yellow that has been historically shown. Near Middle Eastern is purple. Indigenous people is green, and that speaks to green for the land of the earth. And Latinx people are yellow, and it's good in a way, it's another primary color. So that is like the scheme that we use for the different representations of ethnicities in our group. And as we continue to scroll down, and I mentioned before how Black and white are used only editorially, or it's like didactic, giving information. So whenever you see those two colors, typically that's for that purpose. So as we continue to scroll down, we can then look at, okay, there is a series of grids that we came up with for how do you represent this kind of like this graphic for this glyph. And this is a primer for how we will read the graphics, the glyphs that are coming up next. And it's a 9-cell grid that has representations of nationality, age, gender, sexuality, and the Z, which is this other element that kind of doesn't fall in one category. So it kind of like, it bunches up a lot of things in this category for us. It's a different type of element. And so this grid, the elements of the grid that are important to know that the nationality, gender, and sexuality always happen in the middle of this 9-panel grid. And then age and Z happens on on the parallel sides. And that leaves us like kind of 4 empty kind of spots to then start adding in information as we continue to develop this project. And it's something I think that Jaclyn talked about is like, we are still in process, right? We have not solved this issue. And humans are complex, so will we ever solve these issues? But this is a way that we are looking at it and trying to understand this kind of complex situation graphically. So if we continue to scroll down, and so now here are examples of these glyphs. So we took the show Altered Carbon, and I probably chose this one because it's one of my favorite shows on Netflix, but because of the whole element that it's like you're dealing with humans, you're dealing with post-humans, you're dealing with this whole idea of multiplicity and diversity of people. And looking at this grid, we are showing like the color. So for example, this first one is the blue, is looking at Takeshi Kovacs, that main character that is in Altered Carbon. So the color is representing him as Japanese ethnicity, which is that blue. And then if you look at that middle top grid, JPN and HUN, because he's Japanese and Hungarian, right? So this whole element of how we represent nationality. So we talked about, do we do it via flags? How do we represent nationalities? And so we ended up saying that we're going to use the ISO, the International Standards Organization code for countries. So that's how we're representing nationalities. There's also this kind of scheme of how do we represent sexuality and gender, which is that circle block, and we'll talk about that later. And in this instance, we're also representing sexuality with the heart in this example. And the 3 balls that happen on that right side in the middle, that represents the various sleeves that these characters portray in this one show. So that's that Z category, because it's something that doesn't happen often in a show. But in this instance, it was an interesting opportunity to represent a unique character element storyline in Altered Carbon. And then on the left side, that left column, you'll see that the age is being represented by those bars, which Benjamin will talk about in a minute. And you'll see how we kind of like morphed and grew graphically and like how we represent things, because in this instance, age is represented as horizontal bars. Soon you'll see that we've changed how we do that. And so looking at the different elements, so at a glance, graphically, we would love to have this be a language so that people could just look at this and get all the codes, the elements of what this graphic represents. So with this yellow, this is the Latinx character, Kristen Ortega, and the elements that relate to her ethnicity, her gender, her sexuality. And can we continue to scroll down? And so Benjamin can talk about that was like the hand drawings, like the initial graphic elements, and now the machined version of these elements that Benjamin can explain.
Right. We didn't want to have to hand draw these elements, so we thought we're going to use these generative design rules. And so a lot of that involved reading the tagging that the team did, and coming up with rules like Asian ethnicities are blue, like humans are represented by a 3x3 grid, and like trying to explore like what can we do to generate this machinically. And so here we have the machine version of this top slide. It's the same character. You'll see that you still have the blue grid. You still have the nationality. And then you see there's a lot of divergence with how we treat ages and Z and that continues to change, frankly. So we tried to simplify to the manageable so that we could just get an idea if this was working. And a lot of times it's these initial graphic experiments that kind of showed immediately where our problems were in the schema. So it was this kind of iterative process where we would create graphics, and then we'd be like, well, why does this look so weird? And it looks so weird because, well, things didn't really work in the tagging. So we would go back and fix the tagging and then regenerate the glyphs. So this is actually using our very latest tagging with these very early ideas. So that seems like a good point to talk about the next step. So I'm going to hand back to Veronika.
Yeah, and so we could talk about gender. And what's great about, like Benjamin said, it's like looking at these elements and how in some ways they tested our rules, right, graphically. And sometimes we realized that certain things didn't work, but it's good to, you know, as a designer, you know, as a scholar, as we're thinking, these all things take process. And it's like enjoying the process. And for me as an artist, I usually use this term, it's like getting out of my own way, right? And allowing that process to continue to happen so that you can find those solutions. So as we scroll down more, we can look at this whole element of like, okay, how do we represent gender? And that's what that middle grid kind of shows. It's like these circles. So in the beginning, when Abigail and Benjamin approached me to help to talk about this project, is like, okay, how do we represent gender? And you know, I thought about gender in certain ways, and then I learned from Benjamin, Jaclyn, and Matthew, the scholars in this range of like, okay, you can't think so just one-dimensionally about gender. So when I was looking at gender, we ended up saying that, okay, humans, I use the circle, the pure form of the circle, and then non-humans are the square. So that's the two big differences in gender. But then there are all these multi-layered elements of gender. So the male is represented as the blade, so that's the top half of the circles blackened in, and the female is represented as the chalice, and that's the bottom half of the circle. So yeah, I'm a Da Vinci Code fan, and that's where that all came from, the blade and the chalice. So anyway, the other thing is then, you know, the cross hatching also looks at like, it's that diagrammatic element, and it's also playing on the X and Y axis using math. Math is a universal language. So it's like these multiple layers that are coming into how we graphically represent this information. And so we can scroll down some more and just look at, or maybe we should scroll back up so that you can then see, you know, how that gender gets represented in the machine language version of it. This is all on a website that we can put the link to in the chat. So if you guys want to explore more and like how we are representing this information, our process in its representation, you can have access to that. Benjamin, do you want to talk about the, if we scroll down, do we want to talk about how you got to the age element?
Yeah, at first I wanted to talk a little bit about like, how do we go from this individual character to representing full casts of Alter Carbon or any other text? So Veronika like kind of led the way on our like, how do we conceive of identity as glyphs? But then the research questions that we had were more about like, not just the individual, but whole casts. And then the research team started looking at bigger, like, let's look at all the shows on Netflix. So we kind of ran into a problem at first, like, how do we take this thing for individuals and make it for the many? And so really inspired by the Du Bois grids, we were trying to like aggregate in grids. And as the number of cast members started to increase beyond like 6 or 9, this really started to break down. So what did we do? We revisited plate 11. And in plate 11, you see the shift from a linear matrix to the circular. And so that was, we took that as a design cue and started to think about like, hey, when we're dealing with large number of these individuals, can we go from a grid to a circle? Can we represent this radially? And that will give us greater information density. So we started to think about a grid as, instead of 9 different spaces, as arranged around a circle. So we have low values 1 at like the 1 o'clock position, and high values like 7 at a later time. And using that, we could compress, like, so this is a compressed vision of the current glyphs with this kind of like radial and color emphasis. So we, especially in terms of like larger sets, this proved to be efficient and useful, although, I mean, honestly, some of the grid experiments we did initially are, there's still some promising things there that we should probably revisit and pick up as we get better at this. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the problems that we experienced with dealing with a visual representation of not a thing like I am 100% white or I am 100% Asian, but this idea of mixture and this idea of a secondary tag like playing. Because one of the things that really motivated this research group was a very complex question at the beginning, which was, what is the percentage of actors, or how do we talk about Black male actors from the UK playing American in media text? Like, we wanted to have a kind of design and data vocabulary that was rich enough to start tackling that question. And so when we started talking about major and minor tags and the playing tag, I thought, let's pick a dimension that seems easy. So I picked ages, like foolishly, as it turns out. And again, we return to these Du Bois graphics and this like kind of radial compression and color use. And so we combine that with kind of an organic form, which is a tree ring, and the idea of ages accumulating and growing out from a center. So that was like our initial design approach. And so this is how given our tags, this is how all those values map out into a tree ring. So we start in the middle with like, I don't know, and then like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, up to 100 plus. And as we apply that to like a 40-year-old, we see 4 rings. So that's kind of basic. But then how do we add playing to that? And this is, again, where we started to really have problems. So we thought like, we tried a couple different solutions. We tried blurring. We tried representing age values with Black, age playing values with white. Some of those were useful. And some of those were beautiful graphically. Some of the generated things were really interesting, but it's not this thing where we could look at it and say, this is definitely going to have a Y bias tag. That's what we wanted. We wanted to try to communicate information. And so we, again, like started to backtrack away from a radial form And we started to think a little bit more about how other people have solved this with linear forms. So in this case, this example here is from Lucille Tanzassis. This is from a great talk she did, and this is about kind of like how she represents herself through time and space. And this has really been super inspirational to us, and it was formative in us stepping back from this like easy idea about tree rings to think again about like, can we go the other way? Can we go from a circle to a line? And so in the end, we started to work with a more complex graph form, which I'm going to present an example from Ultra Carbon, although this form is actually, again, one of the things that's more useful for these larger data sets, like all of Netflix or all of Netflix, but just the cis female characters compared to the cis male characters. But to walk through this, it's like an idea of, we have all these age values in Ultra Carbon. These are all the possible ages. But the most of the actors, there's 10 of them whose actual ages are 40. And of those 10, I'm sorry, 4 of them are actually playing that age. And the rest, 6, are doing other things. So we have one of them playing unknown. We have 5 of them playing ambiguous.
100+.
100 plus, sorry. Some of this stuff changed, where we put stuff. And then we can start to like really think about like in this text, who's playing their age and who's playing another age. And is that important? Is that an important thing like bias or reception? Is that like another type of way of looking at this? So we started to compute things like percentage playing for a series. And this kind of like helped with some of the sci-fi genre oddness, where there's a lot of unknown creatures and species, and who knows what the ages are for mythic characters. So like it's another way for us to kind of get at some of the problems with our tagging. So we see in this, we see like a very high percentage, 31% are actually not playing their age. And we do have examples, which are not on the web, of how we are applying this to like Netflix, for instance, where we can see things like, wow, there's no women over 60 who are playing 60-year-olds. And how come on these graphs for women, everything is like slanted to the left? They're always playing younger. Like, so we're just kind of beginning to explore this form, but it has been useful as like kind of as we evolve our thinking on playing and super tags and minor tags. Like, for instance, this is the form that we will use to try and unpack the nationalities in text. So that's, I think, a great place to open it up for questions.
But actually, let me add one other thing, like in conclusion, because what you're saying also allowed us to start thinking about other forms of playing when we're looking at like blackface, like people, African-American characters passing, things like that. So these are things that we haven't talked about right now, but we're setting up the platform to allow that kind of exploration. So we're looking at films like Birth of a Nation, where you've got white characters in blackface playing black characters, and things like The Imitation of Life, a black character passing as a white character. So we've got these great kind of like these platforms to explore these complex issues that are happening in visual media.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much.